Hi guys, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center. The Nehru Center is the cultural wing of the Indian High Commission in the UK, and we've been in existence for many decades, and we organize wonderful events at this very auditorium, which is in Mayfair in central London. Sadly, as you can see, the auditorium is empty. It has been empty since we were all put into lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic. But what we Indians believe is that the other side of a crisis is an opportunity. And what we have done at the Nehru Center is moved all our events online. So now if you attend our online events, every single seat is a VIP seat. Like you get a front row at our events. No trouble of parking, no trouble of traveling all the way. And practically all the programs that we would do, like literary discussions and dance performances, musical performances, we are doing them all on our online channels. You can register for our newsletter at our website nehrucenter.org.uk. You don't need to write them down, they will be displayed at the bottom of the screen. You can also come to our Facebook page, which is a verified page, the Nehru Center. You can follow updates on all our events on Twitter as well, the Nehru Center, that's also a verified account. Or you can come to our YouTube channel, again, the Nehru Center. We are nothing if not consistent. I hope you do come to our online channels and enjoy the events that we are putting up for you. Thank you so much for all your love and support. Namaste, Jai Hind.
Namaste, my name is Amish Tripathi and I'm the director of the Nehru Center in London. We are very proud on this first day of July as we launch this wonderful book called The Indian Sun on one of India's greatest sons, Pandit Ravi Shankar, who took Indian music to the wider world and introduced the world, the modern Western world, to the beauty, the divine beauty of Indian music. And Oliver Craske has written a wonderful biography on Pandit Ravi Shankar called The Indian Sun. We are delighted to launch this book at our Nehru Center, and Nasreen Munni Kabir will be in conversation with him, to absolute stalwarts. So what we have essentially on the online stage of the Nehru Center is two absolute stalwarts speaking on a book about a figure who is almost a god among music lovers. I hope you guys enjoy this event. Over to you, Nasreen ji.
Good evening, everyone. And I would like to first start off by thanking Mr. Amish Tripathi and his team at the Nehru Center for organizing this event, along with the Indian High Commission of India. It's my great pleasure to talk this evening to Oliver Craske, who has written a wonderful, well-researched, very engaging biography of Pandit Ravi Shankar. You know, whoever I've spoken to who has read this book, they have nothing but praise about it. They are quite floored by the amazing and in-depth research that Oliver has undertaken. And I think it's a wonderful thing to have such a detailed biography of one of the legends of our time, and also someone who has contributed to Indian music and to Indian culture in so many ways. And I think it's just wonderful that these biographies are being written, and Oliver has to be congratulated completely for writing something that is quite special. Now, I'd like to not go on too much and invite Oliver to join us. And we are both in London. Good evening.
Hi, Nasreen. Thank you. It's so nice to be here, and thanks for your kind words.
Yes, but they're true, because one reads a lot of biographies and many books and so on, but there are very few that not only capture the personality, but the entire world in which that personality actually inhabits. And I thought that was the amazing thing about the book, because you got a sense of the period, you got the sense of the people he met. It's also wonderful, but before we get into all of that, I wanted to ask you, how did you meet him? And could you perhaps read a little passage from your book describing the moment you first met him?
Yes, I met him in 1994 when he was 74 years old, and I was a mere 23. And I had been given the job of actually, I was his editor first of all. I was working on his autobiography, Ragamala, and I flew out to his home in California to meet him and work with him. I quickly realized he was just a totally creative personality, and he had this sort of magnetism about him and aura, but also a lot of warmth. And I immediately found it possible to get on with him, and he was very likable and absolutely intriguing. So that was my kind of first impression. He had this sort of ability to, even in a full room, he could kind of command the room without any sort of effort. Your attention was naturally drawn to him. Yes, so the extract that we talked about, I'll just read that now because it follows on very much. This is the first meeting. It's just one paragraph. It won't be very long. So it was soon clear that the age gap between us was of little consequence. He was naturally curious, comfortable working with people of all ages, used to teaching students younger than me. I often felt like his pupil, but equally he deferred to me over the written word. I soon observed his democratic spirit, how he could relate equally to a shop assistant or a president. But it went further than that. He just seemed to trust me. Later, when others told me how they got to know him, what resonated was the openness with which they felt welcomed into his life. As Shuchi Bhatt, a London friend of both Sukanya, his wife, of course, and Ravi, told me, once he made room for you in his heart, he really meant it. Our target was to create the text of his autobiography, Ragamala, and over the next couple of years, the book took shape. Ravi shared some of his deepest confidences with me. Strangely, from that first meeting, he raised some matters that he did not want included in the book, explaining, this can come out after I die. So without asking for it, I was being assigned a future role.
I see. And this is the future role, this wonderful book, which I have here. And it's really beautiful. The cover is beautiful. Everything about it is wonderful. But you describe...
Yes, I was going to, he sort of planted the seed, basically, of this book. That's yes. What I meant by that, yeah. And at a time long before I'd ever considered it, obviously.
But you mentioned that, there was no feeling of an age gap between you, but were you not intimidated by him at all?
Well, I was, I'm sure. I mean, I was nervous to start with, but he was very good at putting me at my ease, and I think as I saw him in later times, I saw him like that with other people. He was very good, as I said, with people of all ages. I sort of guessed that was to do with partly his natural personality, but also I think this kind of experience he had of working with musicians of all ages and disciples. He was used to working with people of that age group. I was the same age that George Harrison was when he met Ravi Shankar, interestingly, 23. But as I say, the parallels sort of ended there. I don't want to make any further claims, except to say that, just how open he was. And when George Harrison talked about meeting Ravi Ji, it was the same kind of, some of the same things came up, this sort of feeling like you've been welcomed into this magical world, and all these discoveries that were there to be made.
Mm-hmm. And you said you were there because you were going to work with him on his book. Did he have a sense of history and the importance of recording a life story?
I think that's an interesting question, because I think he did. He was knowledgeable about Indian history, for example. And I think that, a musician has this, he said actually a musician should have awareness of their own worth and pride. And yet, so I think he knew that he had achieved something special, and after all, he was wanting to write an autobiography. On the other hand, there was also this other side of him that was very unworldly. Sukanya tells these funny stories about. I mean, there's a story when she, I think he gave her a suitcase once, and he said, "Oh, it's a useful suitcase. You can make use of it. I don't need it anymore." And she opened it up, and it was full of sort of his awards and certificates and trophies, and there's this sort of unworldliness about him as well. And what was great was that lots of other people collected things, people around him, many people, whether they were disciples or family, other people like Sukanya, other earlier relationships, and that's what created this wonderful archive that I was able to draw on.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, can you tell me a little bit about, in terms of the actually approach that you took to writing this biography? I mean, what did you find to be the toughest thing about writing this particular biography?
Well, I mean, it certainly was a huge responsibility. I felt that. I suppose the good thing was that I had known him for the last 18 years of his life, and had maintained that connection throughout all that period. And I'd always been fascinated and felt there was more to be said about him. So I think I'd resisted that role for a long time, but eventually, this was actually after he died, really, that I felt it had to be done, that somebody should be writing a biography of him, and that actually I was very well placed to do that. But in terms of challenges, sorry,
is it because you had access to a lot of material? Why did you feel you were well placed?
I think because I had that connection to him all his life, and Sukanya, his wife, as well, and she was very encouraging. I plucked up the courage to suggest the idea of writing a biography, and she was completely into the idea. She thought it was a great idea, and she provided access to the amazing family archives, which was just a complete joy, because I was able to, some of it being catalogued, but a lot of it hadn't. So it was a matter of, at times, just opening drawers and having no idea what was in them, and pulling out documents from anywhere in the last 70 or 80 years, or concert programs, or letters and travel itineraries. And I mean, it was a goldmine. It was, I was so lucky like that, and I'm enormously grateful to her and all the Shankar family, for their cooperation on the book.
And yeah, do you think that if you hadn't had access to all of this material, how different a biography would it have been?
I think it would be, it's very, very different. I can hardly imagine how I would have gone about it otherwise, except when I suppose I can, because people write biographies about people who are either there isn't an archive, or they've never known the person as well. There's a big difference when you've known the person, I think.
That's
when you
true.
know your subject. You asked me a moment ago about the challenges. I mean, there's the sense of responsibility about it, which I felt very strongly. Really, I think that that this was somebody who needed to be done justice, and I don't know what you think, but I think there's a lot of, especially Indian figures, who need a really good biography at times. I think that there hasn't been such a strong tradition of biography. I know you've written a lot on people yourself, so I'm curious about your thoughts on that. But I felt that somebody should be doing this about Ravi Shankar. He was such an important figure historically, and so that put this kind of responsibility on me.
Yes. I think the kind of the advantage, in a way, is that most of the conversational biographies that I've done before were about film people, and there is one thing about film people is that they you could see their work, and just as in the same way that you could hear Panditji's work, his music. And that's a big advantage, I think, because I don't know, if anybody undertook something like another biography on Shakespeare, they would have to almost project the meanings of words and the meanings of situations, whereby the actual material, the music or the films, also tell you a lot about these people. And tell me a little bit about, when you hear his music and you knew him and then you wrote this biography, what do you think actually matched? Did they match the personality and the music?
It's a good question. I think that they do very much. I mean, one thing about his music that I was conscious of is that there isn't much. He did write some songs, but there's relatively little by way of text. That when we have a musician who writes their own words, we love to go in and analyze them. So most of his music is instrumental, but there are some key songs, especially for films, or his opera that he wrote right at the end of his life. There's a couple of songs in that he wrote the text himself, and I think were really significant. But mostly it was dealing with music. So I think that, in a way, the most obvious one is that, this is a musical form that expresses kind of deep emotion and spirituality, and that you feel that when you listen to him playing an alap. The kind of really meditative, serene, what he called the highest part of a raga, really. And he was really kind of searching. You can see it, you could feel it, you can hear it in the music. That when he played, if you watched him playing, he was often in a slightly, very much, another world. He was conscious of his audience, but that was really how he felt closest to his divine feelings, was through his music. And that was really important in his life. He had a very complicated life in some ways, and music was always this. It became this kind of sort of like salvation. That he found that was his way of getting accessing his deepest feelings, his spiritual feelings, and so on. And I think that really comes out in the music, and that's really important to him.
Yes. I had the good fortune of actually seeing him in Paris in the 70s or something like that, with Allah Rakhaji and Panditji. And of course, you're absolutely right. You get the sense of spirituality, but also what you got very, very clearly was the ease with which he communicated with the audience. He would talk to them, not only between rags, but it was just a feeling that he was always present for them. He may have been a bit lost in his own music world, but he was very, very present. And you could feel he knew the pulse of the audience. He could read it very well. Was that your experience when you saw him in concert?
Yeah, very much. This is why it's quite hard to generalize, because he was a fascinating, complex person, and that both those things are very true. He was extremely sensitive to his audiences. He was professional to the nth degree, in terms of he always had this responsibility to play a show. He would get very nervous before concerts, certainly in his later years.
And where was that nervousness coming from, do you think?
I think that it was to do with the responsibility of to the audience, to the fear. Perhaps it's good for a musician in a way to still feel that fear that you're not going to be able to perform to your best degree. And so he definitely felt that beforehand. And he would, talking to his daughter Anushka, I can remember her saying how he. The day of a concert, you always knew there was a concert on. There was an atmosphere around the house. There was a tension.
Yes.
So that's really interesting. Even in his 70s or 80s, or he was playing concerts right up until he was 92 when he died, and he played his last concert a month before he died. And but he still felt this responsibility to the audience, and as you say, the sensitivity to them.
Yes, absolutely. Because I think true artists, in a way, this nervousness that you're talking about is from the excitement The excitement of the actual subject, the music or the film or whatever, it's the excitement. And any time you've kind of that excitement goes, you get flat. I think your performance gets flattened because it's routine for you. Whereas if you're excited, that's something else. Now, when you were writing, obviously there was a whole area, or like for example, his marriage to Annapurna Devi and the various other his various affairs and so on. And you're very open about it, and you write about them very clearly. But are they? Is it difficult to kind of approach these subjects, or do you find that you didn't need to skirt over them?
Well, I think I spent a lot of time trying to think about how to deal with those parts. But I think I wanted to do to write a proper serious biography that looked at him in the whole, so which included his personal life. I think that was necessary, and I think that the readers would want that. So I spent a lot of time. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't an easy thing to do, but I always wanted to try to be fair to all parties. You refer to his first marriage, for example, and especially in India, there's been fascination about that for decades and decades. He married his guru's daughter, and a great musician herself, but who barely played in public. And people have always been fascinated about the dynamic between them. But I wanted to try to see things from her side. I'd heard his side, but I unfortunately I wasn't able to interview her. I did approach her. It was just shortly. It was towards the end of her life, and she notoriously didn't give interviews anyway. But she did respond and actually wish the project well, which was important to me. And so I think my response, my approach was to try to see it from everyone's side, and if a relationship fell apart, it's not about blaming. It's about trying to understand what happened. So I hope that that's worked. I feel so far comfortable with what I've written.
I found it to be completely, you're not skirting over anything, and also you kind of allow the reader to understand the complexity of a personality. People are not just one thing, and they're not one thing at one age. They keep changing, and that sense of change and that sense of how he dealt with his relationships and everything comes across, extremely well. But when you were talking to him, was he very aware of the passage of time or the passing of time? What did time mean to him? Not musical time, but time in general.
Well, he was in musical time. He was an absolute master, and he loved rhythm. I think that. So I met him. He was 74. So he's already quite an old man, and I think that perhaps there's by then there's a sort of element of acceptance, maybe. That he knew that his time was limited. He'd had a couple of heart attacks. But he just wanted to keep going. He was this creative personality who wanted to keep playing music right to the end, as I said. And he was certainly, one thing he was really focused on at that time was teaching Anushka, who, when I met him, was 13, and that was a really high priority for him. But so I think it's an interesting question. I think that there was a level of acceptance about him. On the other hand, he had a lot of health problems in later years. He had a lot. I think it was 17 angioplasty interventions. So there was sort of a lot of work going on to keep him alive, actually, at this stage, and able to keep performing. Which was so important to him. And also the music then kept him going as well. I think if he hadn't been able to play music, then I don't think he would have kept going all those years.
Yes, because actually I was quite surprised because I did not realize when he was around. I mean, we were not aware, as his fans, really, of this poor health that he suffered. And when I read that whole question of his health and how much he was suffering, I was very surprised, almost shocked about it. And I was just wondering whether you felt, how much did it influence his kind of his sense of what he was going to continue giving to the world in terms of his music, but his own mortality and his family and his brother, who was Uday Shankar, who was also a key figure in his life. It's a very complex thing when somebody is suffering from ill health and pain. What sense did he talk about it?
I think, I mean, you mentioned Uday. I think he had a bit of a shock seeing his oldest brother declining health in later years, and there was a period where he feared he might end up like that as well. But he had this, I don't know, he still had this incredible energy about him, that kept him going. That was my overall impression. I don't think that how much did it influence him? He was this incredible creative fount, of all this music was coming out of him. And you can't imagine, after the age of 89, he composed a concerto, a symphony, an opera. This was like a return to these Western classical forms that he had earlier had composed in and been very interested in. But this was in a way, in some ways, it was the same person. Still, he always said he felt like there was a sort of young and childlike and playful person within him, even if the body was creaking a bit. That was what he wanted to do. I think that the health problems maybe limited how much he could do. There were times when he was unable to perform, or his energies were low, and so on. But he still was, phenomenal. Creativity in those later years. He used to, he was still only sleeping about sort of 4 hours a night in his advanced age, and would wake up in the middle of the night, and then start tapping out a rhythm or singing a melody. He just couldn't. He said it was almost like torture. Something would come to him, and he wanted to explore it. So there was no real lessening, of that urge.
Yes, actually, when I've interviewed various artists in film, and one thing that is quite common to what you're talking about is a certain childlike quality, and often you found it in their humor and in their laughter. Their voices, when they laughed, became very, very young. I always felt that, and I'm sure it was true of Panditji as well. It wasn't an older person's laughter; it was a childlike laughter.
Absolutely, and I loved his voice. I mean, if I hear it now, it just takes me back to this person who was so full of life and laughter. I mean, he was so playful. That's something I meant to say when in his concerts, that it wasn't, you had these sort of very high spiritual moments and so on, but there was also this playfulness, especially when he got onto the rhythm and the improvisations, and that came from his personality as well, and that had. I came to realize had always been there, because if you looked at accounts of him when he was a young man, he had this sort of life force, I think, in him, and that was still there, and that really you felt it in him. You definitely heard it in his voice. He had this sort of slightly high pitched voice, very bright, and just such an infectious laugh. I mean. And this is really important to understanding him. There's a lot of pain in his life, and in his own account of it, you would often hear about the sort of moments of pain, and this obviously so important, to understanding him. But most of the time, you felt this sort of infectious personality.
Did you find him to be a moody person? And just was he always the same in terms of his temperament?
No, I think he changed a lot, from time to time, and but I mean, I never saw him. I only once saw him lose his temper, and that was with me, and that was my fault. So
what did you do?
I was late. Late.
How late?
I can't remember.
Okay.
But it was for a recording. That was the problem. And I felt so bad afterwards. And I mean, people who know me would say timekeeping is not my best quality, but he was really, really conscious of time. As I said, he was incredibly professional, and this is all part of one of the many things I think that made him so successful. But no, I mean, Moody wise, I think that you had the sort of the artistic personality. You get the sort of changes of mind a lot. The thing I remember that he used to change his mind on a lot was when I would ask him, or somebody would ask him, what he thought about the kind of future of Indian classical music. What was the future going to be like? And I found that the opinion would change a lot from one meeting to the next. I suppose depending on what had recently happened, something had inspired him or something had depressed him, and he was very sensitive like that to to what was going on. I'm reading this comment from Sukanya on screen. Can you see that, Nasreen?
Yes.
Yeah,
it's a nice
that's
story.
his playfulness.
Yes. And also, she had once told me that he was a very optimistic person. Did you find that to be true?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I mean, I think that he always bounced back. That if he went through problems himself, he always bounced back, and he was always interested in younger musicians, for example. So he had that kind of interest in the future. He wasn't somebody who just felt, it had been all much better in his time. So yeah, I agree with that.
Mm-hmm. And did you witness a lot of when he'd have sessions with the students and teaching? Did you was he firm with the students, or very open, or forgiving, or stern?
I think he could be all those things. I saw some lessons. I didn't see a huge number, but I saw some, and I've seen footage of others. And I've spoken to a lot of the disciples as well. One of the things I did for the book was to interview actually over 130 people. So a lot of the disciples I spoke to, and in the tradition there is a sort of natural fear of your guru, and he could certainly be very stern musically. If they were not, they'd not been practicing, or he was getting frustrated with something musical. I heard that story lots of times, that he could be stern musically, but I'm
just thinking,
at the same time,
stern guru himself. He had a very stern guru himself. Brilliant.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So, but he wasn't like that with his students, was he?
No.
Is it because the times had changed?
They're different personalities as well. Absolutely, very different personalities. I think that he. I mean, his guru, I should say, he was incredibly important to him, Alauddin Khan Sahib, who had a sort of famously severe temper, and used to beat his students. The only one he didn't beat was Raviji, and that must have been, well, those, I don't really know how to interpret that. Those were different times, and one might say. But he wasn't like that at all. No, he was very caring. He loved teaching, and he took interest in their lives as well, because that's part of the guru-disciple relationship. Yes.
And he would get impatient with them if they didn't learn fast.
He might get impatient, but that's a musical issue, and if they, as I said, if they hadn't practiced or something, but they all told me how wonderful those sessions were, that how much you would learn from it, and then afterwards maybe there would be, they would all sit down to dinner afterwards, or there would be, playing charades or something, or there was that kind of total relationship. Yes. It's not only about music.
Yeah. And for someone who was so busy and who led such an incredibly active life, did you find he had a good memory? I mean,
he had very good. Yeah, he had very good memory, actually. I mean, not having done the research, I know it was not immaculate, but nobody's memory is. But he had I would say, a phenomenal recall for the most part.
And did you have a lot of fact checking to do?
An enormous amount, yeah. I mean, the research, by going through archives and then doing all these interviews and then matching them all up, that's, in a way, that's sort of naturally you're correlating different accounts and checking them against each other. So, yeah, There was a lot of that, but yes, I was doing it myself. Apart from people who I called on for answering particular questions.
And how long did this biography take you?
I would say about 6 years nearly. The research period was about 4 years. I started it after he died, and then I think the first new interview I did was 2014, and that's not full time, but it was. I spent a lot of time on the research, and I went to India several times for that, and to California as well, and interviewed, as I said, lots of people all over the place, New York as well, and then when I could wait no longer and I had to get on and write the thing, probably about 18 months to write it. Yeah, and then I had to hit a deadline at the end because last year was his centenary of his birth, April 2020, and that was the when we launched the hardback edition. And so last year was, as I said, the centenary of his birth, and unfortunately there were lots of events that got called off, obviously because of the pandemic. But the book went ahead. The book had already been printed, so. That was the hardback came out last year, and hopefully as many of those concerts and other events are going to be happening anyway. There's a big Shankar centenary concert at the Royal Festival Hall, which is in March 2022.
Oh wow, that's great.
So that's postponed from last year.
I see. Now, I mean, it would be very odd for me not to talk about his film work because of my own interest in cinema. Obviously, Ray's Patthar Panchali is the most famous soundtrack in India and there are many places. But I was also surprised reading your book how many films he worked on here, including Nicha Nagar, which was like in 1947 or 48 with Chetan Anand. But there was one thing you mentioned, and I immediately checked it out on YouTube, and I was fascinated by it, was this short, The Cherry Tale. I thought it was brilliant because he understood completely how to give pace, rhythm, personality, everything to that little, that film. And anybody who's interested in this connection between music and cinema should definitely watch this on YouTube. It's really a masterwork. I feel
it's a wonderful film. Yes, it's just a 10-minute film, and he made it 1957. The filmmaker's name was Norman McLaren, and it's like a sort of live action animation. So it uses it's a lovely film that as you know, Nasreen, there's a man who wants to sit down on a chair and the chair won't let him, and so they play this sort of game evolves. He's trying to persuade the chair. Why won't the chair let him sit down? Eventually, he realizes that the chair wants to sit on him, so he does. He allows the chair to sit on him, and then the chair is sort of in this animation is exuberant, and then allows him to sit down. And the whole thing, there's no soundtrack except for the music, so all the way through. So it's Raviji's sitar and tabla by Chatulal and some sort of percussion effects and so on. And so Raviji wrote the music, performed it. It's like a little masterpiece, as you say. It's amazing.
It's a masterpiece, really, because the music gives the whole energy and the involvement as a viewer to it, and it was just beautifully done. And I was really impressed because it's very difficult to keep the attention of the spectator when you are dealing with non-verbal, no dialogue situation. And also film music, whether we talk about Patthar Panchali or the people in India or know Anuradha, which is a wonderful soundtrack again, and Meera and so on. He did many films. Writing for cinema is episodic. I mean, it's fragmented music, really. And how do you think he did you ever discuss with him how he approached the difference between playing a full raga for 40 minutes and this episodic situation for cinema?
Yes, he was he made these two early films in 1946-47, as you said, Nicha Nagar and Dhati Ke Lao.
Yeah,
And
Dharti Ke Laal is a master. I mean, he's also, these are, both of them are classics of Indian cinema.
Yeah. And he, right from the start, he was really focusing on the background music. So there are some songs in one of those films, but he kind of had a conception. He wanted to apply classical music, Indian classical music, to films, and this had not really been done in this way, to have Indian classical musicians. So most, correct me if I'm wrong, but most Indian soundtracks were based around orchestral music at that time, and songs, and rather like Hollywood in the same way, I suppose. But he really wanted to pursue using Indian classical music, the instruments, Indian instruments. So this is all happening at the same time as Indian independence is about to happen, and it's all tied up with that feeling of pride in Indian culture, and that's a big theme in his career, right from that period. That he had seen the beauty of Indian classical music, and he wanted other people to feel that as well. And he felt he could apply it to cinema. He loved cinema from his childhood, so he was, in some ways quite a natural fit to being a film composer. And yeah, he loved that.
Yes. And have you any idea whether how he liked Indian films, and did he watch them? I mean, the big popular films. Did he ever talk about which stars he liked, or Dilip Kumar or Madhubala? Did he ever talk about all that?
I didn't really quiz him on that, actually. No, I should have done. I know. I mean, I'm sure he had his favourites, and Sukani will know.
Yes.
But that wasn't particularly my area. But I think what's really interesting is that, as I said, all his soundtracks were based on Indian ragas and talas and music, and indeed all his music was. I mean, that's one thing that people don't always realise with all these collaborations and things he did later on. It was always based on Indian raga. And yet, in the film music, there's quite a lot of different styles. There's Patha Panchali, which is this very evocative, beautiful, folkish type music. You've got a big Hollywood film like Gandhi, the big Oscar-winning film. So he was the composer on that. And then Anuradha, which you mentioned, which is much more like sort of it's Bombay. Yeah. Bollywood songs. These are songs, and with great lyricists, and he's written the music, and so there was a range within that, and he, as you said, it's episodic. He loved all that. I think, the opportunity to illustrate and to bring out.
Yes, because it's very different, I suppose, to perform music, and also the music that is heard, whereas cinema, it's music that is also seen, and the dynamics change completely. And he really he mastered that very, very well. I mean, the Pathar Panchali of music is, I think, one of the few times in the tradition of cinema, and especially Indian cinema, you have a soundtrack that is as famous as the film. Just a few notes, if someone played them, everyone knows where they came from, which is like, I shouldn't compare the two, but it's a bit like the few notes of Jaws. Everybody knows the shark's coming.
Yeah.
But here it's not exactly a shark, but it's still that, And
I was just going to say that you mentioned earlier that it was surprising just how many films he had composed for, and I was surprised doing my research. I kept digging out more and more films, particularly Bengali films, in that period after doing the Upper trilogy.
Yeah.
So in the next decade, there were a lot of films that are out there somewhere, and would be great to see them shown. That would be great.
Yes, but as you said, that when he was growing up, and the influence of his brother was that they were at the forefront of forming the cultural identity of North India. The IPTA and Uday Shankar's academy, they were very, very instrumental in the arts in actually determining what would be the model or template. Like Uday Shankar's film Kalpana, I don't know if you've seen it, but
Yeah.
it actually announced the way Indian cinema could have gone. In other words, completely constructed on music and dance, and the way it became much more to do with dialogue and melodrama and so on. So, but that division took place. And for people who don't know, it's also very interesting, the film historians, that actually one of Uday Shankar's students, Madam Simki, did the choreography in Avara in the wonderful Raj Kapoor dream sequence. And so you can feel the Shankar influence, but it's all very subtle and it's completely there, you know. I wanted to know, in terms of Panditji, what do you think his greatest legacy is going to be?
Big question. I think really what he did was to really put Indian culture on the global map. I'm slightly reluctant because I also think he was really important within in India, and I think that's slightly been forgotten, that he played a really important role in some of the ways we've talked about. But I think that his biggest legacy is to have put Indian music into the mainstream of Western culture, and that also opened the doors to all kinds of other Indian cultural riches, you know, whether it's dance or sculpture or sort of yoga or clothing or incense sticks, or, you know, there's so much that he helped to make us aware of that in a way we've forgotten now how it came about. But this period in the 1950s and 60s was so important in shaping how India was seen in the world. And then also, I think, opening for people in other parts of the world, in the West and the East as well, all around the world, making them more open to other musical traditions from all around the world. You know, there's this rather unpopular word now, world music. You know, some people don't like it, but that sense that instead of Europeans or Westerners being focused on their own great traditions, just opening minds and ears to that. And he was so important in that because he was really pioneering that. He was doing it at a time when, you know, that wasn't being done.
Yes, and obviously in his life, which you talk about in great detail, he met an extraordinary amount of artists and people all around the world. And there is a question from one of the viewers, and they were asking if you could enlighten them a little bit about his interactions with Menuhin and Harrison.
Yeah, and it was really nice to see this question from Chinmoyji, who yes. I know.
Chinmoy Guha, yeah.
So this was like a really key moment a couple of really key moments in his career. He met Yehudi Menuhin as early as 1952, when Menuhin was coming on a tour to India. Menuhin was already a globally famous violinist, and he had a sort of moment of conversion when he saw Ravi Shankar playing. He was taken. He had lunch with Nehru one day, and then the next day, you know, he got to see Ravi Shankar performing, and it was a converting moment for him. You know, he was one of these people whose ears were opened, and then he went around telling everyone about it, and he was helpful in getting Ravi Shankar invited to various concerts and things over the years, and eventually they collaborated in 1966 with Menuhin trying to play Indian music, and they played famous duets together. And that's the same year that Ravi Shankar met George Harrison, 1966. So this is such a pivotal time in his career. It's when everything is exploding. So there are pop stars like George Harrison who have heard Indian music and been, you know, sort of had their minds blown, and he became very genuine devotee of the music. And at the same time, you've got a classical musician like Menuhin, and you've got another one like Philip Glass, who from a very different classical tradition met Ravi Shankar, worked with him, and his musical direction was changed. So this is all going on in that period. It was really a tremendously exciting period, I think, for him. And I always think it kind of pivoted around the summer of 1966, but it was going on for all that period, you know. Lots and lots of musicians from different traditions who were influenced by him. John Coltrane was another who he was tremendously influenced.
So it's in many fields. It's not just classical music, but it's also Philip Glass. You could say is to some extent, of course, classical background, but very experimental. Because I saw his play Eisenstein on the Beach. It's very experimental, really, and yet he could
Very much
fit in.
Einstein, yeah.
Yeah, Einstein. Sorry, Eisenstein. I'm thinking of the filmmaker.
You've got a film on your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that, Oliver. But the thing is that basically it is that he could fit into every musical world. That I think it was amazing, because sometimes you have some of the classical musicians who are quite close to the other worlds, there is another question that's popped up, and which is Richard Frere, and he says he's a big fan of the music of Ravi Shankar and Vilayat Khan. Was the animosity between them real, or was it just Blur versus Oasis type of media play?
I think a bit of both, to be quite honest. I think that there was a lot of warmth between them. I was really interested to come across a letter where it showed that Vilayat Khan had stayed with him for 10 days in Delhi in about 1950. So there was a lot of warmth and mutual admiration. But in public, Vilayat Khan's absolutely incredible musician himself as well. And Richard is quite right. It's perfectly okay to like them both. But he did have a habit of rather putting down Ravi. There was in public statements and so on, and that caused some tension. Of course, it did.
Yes, I understand that, because maybe privately it would be different, but there's no story if they all got on.
Well, yes, exactly.
What would the media write about if they were all friends?
People are complex, aren't they? And it's okay to have these.
It is okay. I think
rivalries
sometimes
or so on.
Yes, could be healthy. Sometimes it actually makes people very creative. Look at John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
Exactly.
Look at the songs they created. So actually, the
competition, helps as well. Yeah.
It helps because it makes you want to do better, always better, and sometimes about somebody doing better.
I was going to say how great that India produced not only Ravi Shankar but also Vilayat Khan, and
so many.
Khan, Ali Akbar Khan,
Nikhil Banerjee, also very.
All these great musicians, and then the tabla players, Ala Rakha, and
yes.
There was actually a whole generation of musicians who emerged in India around the time of independence. Incredible riches, really, and really dominated for the second half of the 20th century. And I like to see Ravi as the sort of the first among equals among them. But it's not putting anyone else down. But I think that his impact was obviously bigger.
It was very big.
He's a very interesting character.
Yes, yes. If I may just come back to cinema for a minute, there was Satyajit Ray and there was Ritik Ghatak. Now they're both brilliant filmmakers, but Mr. Ray was recognized in the West and became the star. And I think that meant that Ghatak's work kind of was not seen as much. And I don't know, sometimes it's not, I don't think, up to the individual. They don't chart their life like that. These things just happen. I don't think you willfully say, well, I'm going to do better than X or Y. It's just your partly luck, partly your talent, partly circumstances, and also personality.
Yeah. Ravi Shankar, I remember him telling me that he loved the films of Ritik Ghatak. The Cloud Capped Star.
Oh, yes, that's beautiful.
Was a big favorite of his. But they never worked together. It just never happened. He worked with lots of directors in Calcutta, but not him.
But what is interesting is that this film that he talked about, Ghatak's film, in it actually the best sequences of Baal singers. So it may have been that music that he loved as well in that particular film.
Yes,
and it's beautiful, and it's about a young man and a sister and brother, and the young man wants to be a singer, and there's some amazing shots of him walking along the riverbank singing, and I'm sure all of that must have really moved Panditji.
I'm sure he was very moved also by Patha Panchali, as you mentioned, and yes. I was really struck. I eventually twigged myself that Patha Panchali is this story about young boy growing up in Varanasi in the 1920s, who loses his sister. Sister dies, and then he loses his parents in subsequent episodes of the trilogy. And then of course, Ravi Shankar, he lost his parents young. He lost an older brother when he was just 8. And he was growing up in the 1920s in Varanasi. And they almost sort of look a bit similar, these great big eyes. And, these scenes of the boy running around the lanes of Varanasi. So I think he responded it to, perhaps one reason why the music is so good is because he really felt it.
Yeah. And he lived it,
and it came out in the music, which he recorded in one night. That's the way he often wrote best. As because he's an improvising musician. That's the tradition. And when inspired, it raises you up to achieve your best work. And it's incredible to think that they just did that in one all-night session.
Really, but sometimes you find that artists, really true artists, they react very, very quickly. And that sentiment with which they react connects somehow to the audience who sees the film for that first time and reacts in the same way. So it's those instant reactions that grab you. And I think, as you say, it's his childhood. And in that tune, Pathar Panchali tune, which I don't know whether you could hum it for us, but in it...
I'm not going to try it, no.
No, you're not going to try, okay. But in it, you really have the feeling of Bengal. I don't think the minute you hear it, you could feel you're in Bengal.
Yeah.
And obviously Bengal meant the world to him, as much as Banaras.
Yes, it did. He was very, very strongly conscious of his Bengali identity. And had lots of Bengali friends and all his whole life. But he never lived in Bengal. It's really interesting. He grew up outside. He was Pravasi.
But in a way, that makes you more attached because you have a very romantic idea.
Yeah. And yes, and Calcutta is also a great, city of musicians as well. So he would constantly come and go, and was very popular there as well.
Yes, we could say so much more about him, but I think what you capture really very well in your book is the complexity of Panditji. The complexity of his personality, but also extraordinary life he had, an extraordinary life. I think he lived like what most people have, like 20 lives in one. The people he met, extraordinary.
I feel it was a great life, that he lived as well, right from his, we've touched on the fact that he was in his brother's dance troupe.
Yes.
If people don't know this, he grew up in Varanasi, but at the age of 10, he was whisked off to Paris because Uday was in the process of forming a dance troupe, which then performed Indian dance to audiences in Europe, all over America, 4 tours to the USA, and back to India as well. And this is in the 1930s. And Ravi Shankar was a dancer and a musician in that troupe. That's the start of his life, And he did incredible things. He was in. He went to the Cotton Club in New York. At the time when it was the heart of. Saw Cab Calloway playing there. He hung around in Hollywood parties with film stars as a child. What married wrestler wanted to adopt him? He was so cute. He was blessed by Tagore. He sang for Gandhi. It's just this is the beginning of his life. And that's before he really commits to the music, and then he goes back to India, learns from his guru, Aladdin Khan Sahib. So that, that's the start of it, it's an incredible life that he had.
Really incredible. And also it shows that kind of start, you could either become, very difficult for you to get on with people or that you'd fit in any environment. And as you pointed out early on in this conversation, he could speak to anybody, a taxi driver with as much respect and affection as a movie star. And I think that comes from these travels and the fact that he learned to adapt to new environments.
Yes, from an early age. I think that was all, ingrained in him in that early period. And also, very importantly, he learned stagecraft, how to present a concert, and he learned this professionalism as well from being in that troupe. These are all really important things. And of course, he was also exposed to music of the countries he was in. He heard Western classical music or American jazz, folk musics. That all opened his mind, And what were they doing in that period? They were presenting Indian culture to audiences who weren't familiar with it.
Yes, because as you say, he was definitely obviously classical music, but also he understood that music, there isn't one way to approach music. That's a very key lesson, to learn that thousands of doors can open. Oliver, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, but before I let you go, I want to ask you one final question. How do you think this biography has changed you?
Good question. Well, I think it's probably the thing I've done that I've been most proud of. But no, it definitely is. So I don't know. I think I feel very lucky to have had the opportunity to have such a wonderful subject to, first of all, to get to know him. I don't know what I did to deserve that particular introduction.
I don't know.
But then now, there was this book that I think was there to be written, and that I got that opportunity. So I don't know. Maybe it's too early to say how it's changed me, Nasreen, but I certainly feel really grateful, and it was a very exhausting but also very rewarding journey.
Yes, and you were telling me that this journey was also possible, and you wanted to thank some people before we signed off. And could you tell me, who do you think was the most key helper to you?
There's no doubt about it. It would be Ravi Shankar, his second wife, who has been tremendously supportive in giving me interviews and giving me access to the archives, as I said, and introducing me to so many people in his life, and allowing me to go away and make my own researches and draw my own conclusions. And then and then she read the whole book, and I wanted her to. It's really important, I think, for this kind of book that the most key people give you feedback, because you can get things wrong, so easily. And so she would be the key. I also hugely grateful to both daughters, and Anushka, who was really interested in I think in the kind of process that I was going through, to kind of the psychology of her father as well. I think we both found that was really fascinating, trying to understand why he was the kind of person he was. Nora Jones as well, his other daughter, kind of gave me an interview. So I'm really grateful to family. Very happy to be published by Faber and Faber. I couldn't ask for a better publisher. And my editor, Linda Matthews, has been wonderful to work with. And my agent, David Godwin, I would also very like to thank. There are literally hundreds of people who helped me with the book, but those would be I think, at the top of the list. And thank you to the Nehru Centre for inviting us on here today.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think it calls for the time to go back and listen to a CD and listen to Panditji, rather than watch.
I hope that if people enjoy the session or read the book, that it will inspire them to go and listen to some of the music. That's the best response.
Yeah.
Really.
Which rag was your favorite? So we may try and find a CD.
Oh, I don't know. There's so many, but I mean, I think Yaman Kalyan is often some of his most wonderful pieces are in Yaman Kalyan. So that you could definitely start there.
Okay. So instead of watching Wimbledon, I should Yaman Kalyan.
Yeah, or put it on as a soundtrack maybe to the
to Federer. I think he's on.
Yeah. But yes, thanks so much. And the book is available now. It's out in paperback in the UK and India as well.
It's a beautiful book. I have to say, it's a beautiful book, and it's the photographs are beautiful, and I love the way that you've chosen the photographs. It shows Panditji with his sitar, and as he ages, I like that. The chapter, it's like chapter headings in different parts, times of his life. It's really lovely. I think we could go on for a long, long time, Oliver, but I think we should say goodbye now and thank everybody for watching. And I hope they enjoyed the conversation, and hopefully they'll get hold of the book, because it's a wonderful read, and it's a serious and a very engaging read. And thank you very much, Oliver.
Thank you, and so thank you so much as well, Nasreen. I really enjoyed the conversation. So
me too. Me too. Thank you then. Bye then. Bye.
Bye-bye.